Hey, you're through the books, boys. You've got Dean and PJ on the line. Who's calling?
Who's this?
Hi, this is Susan Furber.
What? That's a crazy coincidence. We were just talking about your book.
PJ was just
That's a-
telling me all about it, so that's great timing.
oh my God. Well, Suzanne, welcome to the show. I've got a lot of things to ask you about the book. First of all, I love the book. It's
Oh, thank
really,
you.
yeah, I mean, and it's your first book, right?
Yes, yeah. It was my first
Yes.
published book. I've been writing,
All right. Okay.
well, I've been writing like stories since I was a kid.
Okay.
So when I die, my estate can have that.
And is this the first novel you wrote, or is there also maybe some unpublished stuff?
That should stay
Unpublished novel.
unpublished. Yes.
Okay, stay
When I
unpublished. Okay.
when I was younger, yes. But yes, I actually wrote the first draft of this when I was 19.
Oh
Um,
wow. Okay. Didn't know that.
So yeah, and then it was published just last February
Yes.
when I just turned 29. So it was kind of like 10 years in the making in a
I was
way.
trying to figure out the gap, but also thinking never ask a lady her age. So like some time has passed. I do not know how much.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I know you were born in 1992. It says at the back, and I thought it was very interesting because we're all
We're all
92 kids,
1992, yeah.
Sorry.
which is the cool class. This is the best year, right? And I thought it was very interesting as well because I also wrote a novel, but I haven't published it yet. I just thought it interesting to see a really contemporary author to all of us on all of the same year. And I've got a question about that first of all. So I was mentioning that the book is set in 1941 to onwards to the late 40s, but mainly it's set in 1941, and it's upcoming to the Pearl Harbor events in the
Yes.
US. And I was just wondering, first of all, so being born 1992, what exactly attracted you to write it in specifically 1941, which isn't, and just before the war, it's kind of at least for Europeans, I feel it's a very gray sort of areas. Like what's a lot of happening in Europe, but what is USA doing, at that time, because it wasn't involved in the war yet. So it starts up
Yeah.
in March 1941, right?
Yes, it starts in
Yes.
March 1941 and sort of concludes the main action of the
Mm,
novel in April of 1942.
yeah.
And then we do have her reflecting about 10 years later. So, late 40s, early 1950s.
Yeah.
And I suppose why I was drawn to the era is because I've always loved historical fiction or fiction written in a different time period. So it would have been contemporary fiction to them, but historical to us.
Okay.
And my grandmother, who is probably, she was a few years younger than the main character of Lily Kerrigan
Mhm,
when she was growing up at that time in the early 40s. But she would tell us lots of stories about that. And so, I would always glean different facts from her childhood and wonder what her world had looked like. And,
mhm.
she and my grandfather would tell us about that ingraining of that memory of Pearl Harbor being announced and how they had just come home from, mass and how
Okay.
they'd heard that on the radio. And I think those stories infected my childhood and sparked my imagination. So I was always drawn to that time. I also think it is an interesting time historically for women in that it is a time where women were, a certain class of women were
Mhm,
starting to go to university,
mhm,
were allowed to pursue degrees, but
mhm.
were not really allowed to do anything with it afterwards, or
Afterwards.
not anything seriously. They might work for a little bit in marketing or in journalism, but there would come an expiration where they were, expected to get married. And I wondered what it would look like for a woman who was of Sylvia Plath's generation or Betty Friedan's generation, or
Mhm,
even someone like Betty Draper on Mad Men.
mhm,
How
mhm,
did those
mhm.
women become those women in the 1950s? What did
Right.
their education look like? And what did their childhood look like? What did their sex lives look like? Or lack of education about sex look like?
Mhm. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, I think it's very interesting because she's obviously Lily Corrigan. She grew up in this Catholic environment, in this kind of conservative, very much repressed Catholic environment, and reminds me a lot of what my dad tells me about his childhoods in Ireland,
Okay.
especially around Eamon de Valera kind of era. Actually, he's not that old, bless him, but I mean, his parents and just a kind of that environment of the church had a lot of power and there's a lot of repression, and even I feel the effects of Irish repression, honestly I do, and that guilt And I find that's very interesting that she's always guilty, especially when it's related about sex. And also, I suppose she's got an obsession with death. She can't get over her mother's death. And I find that's very Irish. So they did a great job there. It feels like a very Irish character.
Yes, and I think she is second generation Irish in the novels.
Yes.
So she has this, she's Catholic upbringing, and that is in some ways my own upbringing, in that I was brought up in a very conservative Catholic household. I went to a very conservative Catholic university, and lots of the conversations they have in that book are not that divorced from the conversations we were having in about 2010, which is alarming. And again, I think that's why I was drawn to the past, as well as thinking, right, I don't think people are going to understand that, people are still speaking this way. But if I said it in the past and then, think, oh, are we still speaking this way and reflecting it, it might make more of an impact in a certain sense. But certainly the other thing that really came into play was when I was writing the book, the first draft, I had just finished reading The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien.
Okay.
And I remember reading that and thinking, my God, that's the book I want to write. I wish I could write that sort of book, that where she, mirrors those two friends growing up in such close parallel together, and how their stories of coming of age impact one another, and how much authority the church has in their lives at every moment. And again, reading, as I said, lots of Victorian literature growing up, I was operating in a very Protestant literature world. So I didn't know until I read Edna O'Brien or James Joyce that one could actually write about Catholicism and make it interesting, and that loss of faith could be as devastating as, the loss of a lover. So that was, really what I wanted to express in this book as well, is, that I had found that in other books. And I think, again, having that sort of empowered me to then, question my own religion and my own relationship with it. So I think literature is so important in that way, to tell those stories.
Wow. Funny that you mentioned Edna O'Brien, because she's one of these Irish authors that really talked about sex very openly. I think she started writing about the 60s. I'm not sure.
Yes.
But I did read one or two books and thinking age 16, oh, wow, I didn't know this. And, we are 1992 kids, but I didn't know about the stuff she was talking about. Or, it was still very enlightening, even though she grew up in a time where none of this information age didn't exist. So, and James Joyce, and we're just talking, me and Dean, about Iris Murdoch. There are these Irish authors, or in Iris Murdoch's case, partially Irish. But just even if you're just partially Irish, you have this, you do follow this tradition of being obsessed with sex because so repressed, simply. And then it's really nothing that special, as kind of Lily Carrigan, she talks about. At the end of the book, she kind of says, without spoiling it, she just kind of points out it's not that important, sex, but you can't make a big deal of it. And she does make a great deal of it. And the book is very much about her trying to find some answers about sex and being very confused. And it's in that sense, I find it's a very Irish book, I feel like. So it's great.
Thank you for that. And that's really nice to hear, because, as I said, I was so indebted to Irish literature and writing it, and to taking, as I said, sort of Edna O'Brien's story of, going to Dublin in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, and thinking about how that would have looked in America. And again, I love this bit in The Country Girls. There's a really exciting bit where they get on the train to go to Dublin, and that's the most exciting thing they've ever done in their lives. And I'm from a very small town, and I remember that excitement. And I wasn't even going to New York City. I was going to Buffalo, which is not a big city. But it was the city, closest to where I was from. And I remember that excitement of, getting out of the tininess of my little town, and seeing that reflected in literature and thinking, right, that's me. And it's a very different context. And it's a very different story from my story. And, I'm not trying to, sort of appropriate my story or her story or write myself into that, but that's a reflection of going, oh, I know that feeling. I'm so glad somebody else has expressed that feeling.
Yes, and it's interesting that it's timeless, right? So great literature is really timeless, and you can relate to you know, you can relate to Medea, and you can relate to Shakespeare, and you can relate to Edna O'Brien or Ulysses, and it's all amazing. And this love of literature that obviously you have is very much in Lily
Yeah.
and Teddy. So Teddy is basically it's described in the book that she is basically Lily, or in man's form, or as Jack says it, he says the other way around, that he understands Lily because Lily's just like Teddy. But so you've got these teens
Yes.
who are in love with literature, and they're outsiders, and they kind of think of themselves a bit, you know, a bit too good for the rest of them, because they've got all this literature. They're I suppose they're trying to be cynical, but they're not even, because they're that innocent, really. And I
Yes.
find it interesting because in the book at the beginning, they do seem very much like adults, especially Teddy, because I feel like he's getting this, she's making him very mythical. So,
Yes.
and I find it interesting what happens at the end. I'm not going to spoil, but I find just if you reread the book, it makes very much sense why he's being portrayed in such a mythical figure in this kind of using memories. So I like that. But then it becomes clear the more you read that he's just a teenager, and then he's just a teenager, and they're just kids, not even teenagers, and they don't actually know. Yes, and without spoilers, they don't really become that, let's say, sexually educated. Some other naive people in the book that seem naive actually start, you know, make love, let's just say. But she remains a very not naive, but she remains a virgin throughout
Yeah.
the whole story. Really, it was interesting because she's trying to actually get away from that innocent virgin look. She's trying to become a modern woman, and she doesn't know where she is. She's still got that Catholic belief. I love all that. And I just wanted to ask you, so this book, what was the intention of writing this book? Because it feels like a very educative novel for certain people, but I'm just wondering, did you think of a core audience when you were writing this book, or of a certain type of person that you want to read this book?
So I think with all the references to literature, I think there are two ways to read it. And I suppose what I would love for it to serve as is an introduction to these are lots of great books.
Right,
So I remember reading when I was 12, again, one of the sort of gateways for me into literature
yeah.
was reading Anna Green Gables. And I remember there were so many references to Victorian literature, to Tennyson, to Keats, and to Shakespeare. And I thought, oh, I want to understand all those references.
I
I want to
see.
read all those books. And that really then, kind of kickstarted me going, off and finding that. And so I think the book can be read in two ways. I think it can be read by people who have read, the books and get some of the jokes or get some of the references. And sometimes they're very, discreet references, and sometimes they're really quite in your face references, or it just names the book that she's referencing or the writer.
Totally.
But you could get those, but equally you could say, right, I haven't read that person, or that sounds interesting, I would like to go and read that. Or that sort of inspiration of who are Lily's authors, what is forming her worldview. And I was also thinking, while writing it, that everything she has to read has to be accessible to her, so she has
Yes.
to be able to get all of those books. So even something like, she does reference Lady Chatterley's Lover, but it can't quite be the right version because that wouldn't have been available to her.
Yeah, totally.
So how does she get her hands on these? And people like Fitzgerald and Hemingway, of course they're modernist literature, we consider them classics now, but they were popular novels. She would have access to them.
Yeah.
People would treat them as sort of sexy books, but they weren't. She's not reading Henry Miller, for instance, in it.
Yes.
Because
Or she can't get a copy of Ulysses, which is a pity,
yes.
but it's just not 1941 time yet.
Yes. So I was thinking about that too. And again, so I would love, as I said, I would love for people to read it and to think as a gateway to sort of more serious sort of classic literature, actually. And obviously there are echoes of other novels in there too, like The Bell Jar or Edna O'Brien Country Girls, or lots of other books that I love from that period, like Mary McCarthy's The Group, which is just fabulous. Again, she wrote that I think in the 60s, but it's about her time at university in the 1930s and what all the women
Okay.
did after they left university. So again, there's a real love of other books that I
Right.
think Lily would have been reading at that time.
Mm.
In a way, this sounds quite pretentious, I suppose, but in a way, like something like Atonement, where the
Mhm.
character Bryony is so, sort of entrenched in literature and
Mhm.
all the other books that are happening around her at that time. And one of the things Ian McEwan does so brilliantly is to write the Book of Atonement as Bryony, having grown up in that time, would have written the book. So I was thinking about
Right.
things like that too.
Mhm.
Wow, that's great. And I do love the fact that it makes a lot of reference to books. And yes, you're left with a list of books you've either haven't read yet and would like to read, or maybe you'd like to rediscover. I mean, I'd say like you, literature really helped me in my life. So I read a lot of those books, but it still makes me want to go back, I would say, to some of them, because it was interesting because I thought it was a list of books that a very bookish person would read, but up to a certain age. So
Yeah,
I actually read those books up to maybe around 20, I think, which is
yes.
just saying that I think I think there's a reason why she's interested in Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Virginia Woolf at that time. And she mentioned Mrs. Dalloway. I mean, I read that when I was 18, I think, as well. And yeah, it's great because it really it talks to that youth that is very bookish and that's still a minority. Nothing has changed really. So talk to them, say, well, get these books if you like. So it's a great homage to that literature.
So what you're saying, PJ, is this book has got so many book recommendations, people won't even need to listen to the podcast anymore.
I'm afraid so.
read this.
They can just get the book and get all the references.
That's it.
And I find interesting that she becomes, one thing I find interesting is that she does become more interested in world literature when she enters the outside world of her little island, because she
Yeah.
starts to read Middlemarch and Madame Bovary. And I'm not sure if that was that intentional, that her literature, even though she did read a lot of the now considered classics, it was quite American when she was living in the island, and then it became, and now a lot of Flaubert and George Eliot.
Oh, I like that. I actually didn't think about that. I was thinking,
All right, okay.
I was thinking more sort of practically,
Okay.
that those would be the more books that she would have read at university at that time, versus
Okay.
the other ones would have been considered more popular literature, not really worthy of great study yet.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So that's what I was thinking more. But obviously, most of those books do, Madame Bovary, for instance, is about a woman who can never escape the town that she's from.
Yes.
She
Yes.
constantly wants to get to Paris and she never can. So that's part of it. And then Anna Karenina is mentioned several times,
Yeah.
with the train journeys and the inability to break past your constrictive society as well.
Yes, and she mentions which one she likes particularly, which ones she doesn't like. So she does mention that she reads Madame Bovary. She really loves it. I also want to ask you something else. There are several descriptions of parties in the
Yes.
book, and let's be honest, they are not very flattering depictions of parties. And they just remind me more, when she goes into a party, this is a kind of party I would expect from the year 2010 onwards. What exactly was your intention with writing, first of all, so many party scenes that were very disappointing, unflattering, and pretty horrendous in like one or two situations?
Yes. And again, I think that was a huge part for me of the novel, that opening scene where she is, to sort of give a trigger warning around it. She is, she is assaulted by a young man at a party, and it sets her up on this journey of remembering of what happened that year. She is in a state of trauma from
Yes.
that and from other events, obviously previous to that, with the death of her mother, and she's trying to connect those traumatic pieces together, but she sees that as a real sort of start point of her falling apart, I think, mentally.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that's interesting to me. Again, it was part of my own experience of having been at a very Catholic university, that we would go out on Saturday night and we would have these weird
Yes.
parties, and then the next day everybody would be at mass hugging each other. And I would think, that's not okay. You know, were awful to me yesterday. You were predatory. And now you think you can hug me at the sign of peace? That I just didn't understand this mind frame of young men in that atmosphere. And so I tried to imagine how that would have been at the time in the 1940s, a time where, you know, I think what happens to her, even now, I think some people would say, oh, it's not that bad. It's not, you know, it's not the worst thing that can happen. And certainly in that time period, I think people would have been very dismissive of what happens to her. And I was trying to understand how that would have worked. You know, that's sort of parallel between now and then. But some of the other parties as well were, again, I think making fun of a bit. If we're all 1992, we remember the height of the hipster culture. And of course,
Yes.
the 1940s had the similar culture of Bohemia and the beginning of the Beats. And you do read, I read novels where they do make fun of that sort of scene, where that scene is sort of happening, of this pretension of people reading too much in novels, but not really understanding you know what the novel's about. They just, it's like when people read The Great Gatsby and are like, oh, I want to go to a Gatsby party, and you're like, do you really?
Yeah, exactly.
Awful.
Totally.
So I was trying to capture that as well. So yes, so I think part of it is, again, that sort of, how do we find ourselves and locate ourselves in a book from the past, and what scary revelations can we find about our own society within a book set in the past, and say we've moved on so far, or women have moved on so far, and yet women have not moved on, and our society has not moved on in some ways.
I think perhaps a very slight spoiler here, but I think one very shocking aspect is that at the beginning she well, it's right at the beginning, she has a sexual encounter that she's not enjoying at all, and the drunk man says that he will rape her. But the slight spoiler, I find it very interesting that she makes it sound very, what's the word? She tries to make it sound less worse than it is at the beginning. And only as you read the novel, when she comes back to it, because there was an ellipsis, I thought it was just a drunk guy falling asleep. But then it's just, you realize as you read the novel, when she goes back, she just didn't mention it. So she's an unreliable narrator, and I like that. And it just, and it doesn't matter if you mention it or not. It also questions the reader. Well, it doesn't matter if you didn't mention it, you should still not correct. So there's this whole kind of politics of basically this machismo culture, and it's still relevant, and it was then. And this confusion I find was, what is okay, what's not okay. It's not okay, but even women sometimes, I feel, try to belittle it, I feel.
Yes, you sort of pass it off, because I think sometimes when, you know, I think we live in a better world now to some extent than we did even 10 years ago on lots of these issues, where, you know, people talk about them more openly. And it is of course, we have the Me Too movement, where, you know, that's quite public, but, you know, even as just speaking with friends and you saying, oh yes, I've had that experience as well. And you feeling validated by thinking, oh, okay, it wasn't just me. And this is a character who continually is trying to tell people about what happened to her, and nobody really seems to want to listen. They either say, oh, well, no, that's fine, you know, whatever, or they're so far removed, they're actually more naive than she is, so they can't really understand it either. And even the girlfriends who are being dismissive, you do have to wonder, are they being dismissive because they don't want to reinvite their own memories of what's happened to them? I mean, what has happened to them that they have that attitude? So I do think that was, you know, it's very much a part of my experience. I think it's, you know, troublingly too much, you know, part of many people's experiences.
Yes.
But somebody like Lily, what she needs is somebody to say, look, yeah, no, I understand, but nobody ever does that to her. So she's completely insular about it and can't formulate where she puts it in her narrative. And I think that is why she keeps revisiting it and keeps remembering it in different ways, and keeps, you know, sort of eking out different details about it, because she is uncomfortable with the fact that this has happened to her. She is uncomfortable that somebody has come in and taken her narrative from her, has taken her free will from her. And she, you know, there's other things that happen in the book as well, where it feels like for me, Lily as a character is somebody who sees herself as a heroine, who sees herself as a woman of action. But ultimately, she really does nothing in the novel. Everything kind of happens to her, and she doesn't
Yes,
like that.
that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that. So yeah, it's she, because yeah, she doesn't really she has a lot of dreams, but she doesn't really fulfill them in the dream. She kind of just lets things happen, and she drowns herself in alcohol, self-pity, and kind of morbid thoughts about death. um but I find it interesting because I have to say I didn't find her very likable at the beginning, and
Yes.
it took me a while, but I think it's a good character because she seems very cynical, as I said, very mean actually at the beginning. But then if you just peel the layers one after the other, you just find it's just a little girl who's afraid, and all
Yes.
she really wants from Teddy is a hug, and all she wants from best friend Laura is to be understood, and she doesn't really get any of that properly. She doesn't get understood. She doesn't get the connection she wants with Teddy, really. I have one last question.
Okay.
Teddy, being also fond of literature, I feel like he tries to imitate that Hemingway figure. He tries to imitate a bit of Fitzgerald. Yes. What was your inspiration of Teddy? What kind of, if I may ask, was it? Is it someone? Is he supposed to be a collage of male figures you've read about, or do you feel like there are many Teddys out there who want to be this heroic figure and are just teens inside?
I think it's kind of both in a way. I think he is an homage to, well, his name, for instance, is supposed to be Little Women, the character of Laurie, and he's quite like Laurie. And, obviously Lily sees herself as Jo, and Laurie's other name is Teddy. So that's how he gets his name.
Oh, right, okay.
But, he is, again, it's supposed to be, how do we see him? She reads him as a literary character. And I think he likes that. He likes that she sees him as this sort of Hemingway-esque meets, sort of Bronte-esque, hero. He likes that she has that idea of him. So I think he sort of feeds into it. But I think that there are young men that I've encountered who are like him, I suppose, in many ways, where they are. I think the most damning thing that's said about Teddy is where she does sort of have realizations about him every once in a while.
Yes.
And I think, again, that's sort of the older voice coming in and thinking, who was this boy? And she sees him as somebody who is immensely talented, who could be a writer if he wanted to be, who could be a very good writer, but actually, frankly, doesn't want to do any work and will probably piss away his talent through drinking. And she gets that's who he is. And I think that there are, again, even people like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, you could argue, yes, they wrote great novels, but they may have been able to write, more great novels if they hadn't had deteriorated their careers. And there, certainly are young men I've met who, they want the lifestyle of being a writer. They want to have that, heroicness about them, but they don't want to do the work that goes into being a writer. And that's a very big difference. And I think that is something that Lily and he have not in common. That Lily, I think, is actually, for as romantic as she is, for as obsessive as she is about the past and about death and how she can sort of go into languors of morbidity, she ultimately will, at the very end of the novel, she ultimately gets up and she gets on with her day. That's what she always does. She is actually somebody who is, perhaps to her own detriment at times, that she keeps on going. But she does keep on going, and Teddy doesn't really seem to be able to do that.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you one or two quick questions before we wrap up, because we're almost out of time on the episode. I heard the rumor essentially that you relocated because of your love for literature. So tell me a little bit about that.
That's a great question. So I grew up really loving English literature, especially Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and Thomas Hardy. So I remember reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles and then Far from the Madding Crowd, and being, I just had to see these places because he evokes landscape in such a way that you have to see it to experience it. Or the bit in Jude the Obscure where Jude sees, the panoply before him of England. So that's kind of when I had the opportunity, when I was in America, to study for a year in England. I had never been abroad in my life. I barely left where I was from. So again, that is an autobiographical feature, I suppose, in the book, in many ways. And yes, so I came over and then I met an Englishman and I have stayed ever since. I've been here 10 years this year, 10 years this September,
Okay.
a long time.
Wow.
Well,
And
go ahead,
Suzanne,
PJ.
I just like to ask a question.
Yes.
If you could recommend, I'd love you to, from all the books and and also the books you haven't mentioned post 1941, which 3 books would you recommend for someone desperately hungry for literature, having lived in Mars all his or her life? What 3 books would you find the most relevant in literature? Out of the
Gosh,
top of your head.
that's a really difficult question, especially off the top of my head.
Yeah.
There are lots of them. I would say I always go back to Brideshead Revisited by Yvonne Moore.
It's one of my favorite novels.
It's
Yes. Oh,
it's just
very.
gorgeous.
I do find there are some similar themes with Catholic repression and during the Second World War. Okay. Brides Are Revisited by
I love
Edna
it. I
O'Brien.
love it thematically, but it's also just the milkiness of the prose. Just
Yes. Yeah.
you read it and it washes over you, and then you think, "Oh yes, that is amazing that he did that." Those sentences, and you almost start to take for granted how good it is. Another book that I think very much does that for me is Another Country by James Baldwin.
Okay.
Again, it is,
Wow.
quite Henry James and its sort of prose and its style, set in the late 1950s in New York.
Okay.
But it is, it could be set today
Lovely.
with its modernity, and what Baldwin has to say about America and race relations
Yeah.
and
Totally.
homosexuality. It's an incredible book. Anybody who's not read Baldwin yet, I envy them because they have that to come to still.
Okay.
Oh gosh, and a third
Wow.
one.
Last one, yeah.
Oh gosh, what am I gonna pick? Oh dear, sorry, bear with me because I'm trying to think of things that people may not just like pick up naturally. So I'm not going to say Jane
Just
Eyre.
off the top of your heart.
As I said, I really recommend The Group by Mary McCarthy. I think it is a wonderful book. Not enough people have heard of Mary McCarthy. She was a celebrated American writer in sort of the mid-century, and she wrote this book about young women, as I said, going to university, and then what happens to them in New York. Are they the bright young things that they were supposed to be? And they all have these series of events of disillusionment. It's a very funny book. It's a very acidic book. And if you like books about New York and sort of dark comedy, it's all there. But it's also a really, really great, fantastic story. What's her name?
Right.
The woman who wrote Sex and the City really likes it as well.
Oh, really? Oh my God. Okay.
If you read the introduction,
Sterling
it's a very
recommendation.
funny years ago.
Well, out of those books or any other book, the final question we ask everyone, we're almost out of time, but if you could have written one book, what would it have been?
Oh, that's a fantastic book question. I have a very specific answer. It's a book by an author called Rosamund Lehman. It was her first novel, Dusty Answer. And again, it's a bit like Brideshead. It's set in Cambridge, written in the 1920s. And like Brideshead, there is this homoerotic element to it, except it's with another woman. And it's just a really, really beautiful coming of age story that I don't think enough people have read. I don't think enough people know about Rosamund Lehman. And I read it and I think, like, my God, I think there's some books you read and you think, I would have loved to have written that, but I just don't simply have the talent. Like, I'd love to have written Ulysses, but I couldn't have written Ulysses.
Yeah.
But I read that book and I think, I wish I had just a smidge more talent and could have written that book because it's so in my style. I love everything about it.
And now for the most important question of all, where can people go to get your book?
Oh, yes. So they can get my book at any place where good books are sold. I know that's the usual line. So it's obviously available from Waterstones, Foyles, etc., Blackwell's, or you can go to valleypress.co.uk and order through them. If you sign up for the newsletter, I always know you get a 10% discount. And it's a small press. So direct orders, I think, always do help. Okay,
awesome. Well, Susan, thank you very, very much for joining us. You just got the book there.
It's a beautiful book cover, by the way. And The Essence of an Hour is it's a beautiful book. Thanks for the copy as well.
Thank you so much for reading it.
And PJ, you've got to lend me that one when I visit you next month. This month.
Indeed, yes. Indeed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really enjoyed having you on. Have a nice evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.